Hi there. Welcome to a very special edition of Telile 24/7. I'm your host, Adam Cooke, and for the first time in 4 months, I'm actually back in the Telile television studios in Arishat. Yes, we reopened our building this week, so I'm able to do some more material from right here in the studio. And with all that in mind, and with all the changes that have happened in terms of social restrictions here in Nova Scotia, I wanted to bring in a special guest to have a very important conversation about where we are in the COVID-19 pandemic. We've featured him on Telile Community Television before. His name is Dr. Robert Martel. Of course, many of you know him as a longtime physician right here in Isle Madame. We brought him in from his home in West Arishat to help get a perspective on what is happening in terms of COVID-19, everything from reopening the borders to reopening businesses to why we should still be very careful in terms of washing our hands and wearing masks, even at this point of the pandemic with a small caseload here in Nova Scotia. So we're going to share that interview with Dr. Martel in its entirety right now. We hope it's helpful to you. Let's take a look. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Robert Martel. We spoke to him earlier in the course of the coronavirus pandemic. He was kind enough to come to our Telile studios and give us some thoughts about what exactly the pandemic meant and how we should be trying to live our day-to-day lives to be able to stop the spread of coronavirus even on a local level. So we're very pleased to be able to have him back at this stage of the COVID-19 pandemic to share his thoughts about recent developments and just where we are now over the course of dealing with this disease. Dr. Martel, thank you for joining us again here at Telile today.
Well, thank you for having me back.
All right, it's our pleasure, it's our pleasure. So I want to begin realizing that we're now into the fourth month, the end of the fourth month of what could be a very long-term problem. I mean, we know that coronavirus is not going away. We have also heard many reports that the virus is mutating. And I want to begin there by asking you, in your view, do you feel that we're dealing with the same virus that we started with when all the shutdowns and all the precautions really came into effect in Nova Scotia in March? Essentially, has COVID-19 changed all that much during that time, do you feel?
Okay, well, first, I want to lead off by saying that I'm not an infectious diseases expert, nor am I an epidemiologist. So I will give you my opinion based on what I've read and what my colleagues have had to say over the years.
Certainly.
Over the last few months. So with respect to a mutation, all viruses mutate over time. What has been very strange about coronavirus, specifically coronavirus 19 or COVID-19, is that the experience in China, pardon me, Italy, Europe, and now North America has varied dramatically. And perhaps it's because the number of cases in North America have been so much more than the other parts of the world. And as such, we are able to get a much broader experience because of the large sample size. But for example, the issues around blood clotting, which wasn't really reported very much in the early Chinese experience, and even in Italy, where they had a huge outbreak, certainly has been a very significant issue in the United States and in some respects in Canada. It is believed that the virus has mutated to some degree. All viruses do, as I mentioned. The influenza virus mutates year to year, and that's why we changed the vaccine from year to year. So there's no reason to think that coronavirus is not going to behave like other viruses. And I guess the issue is the rate of mutation. With respect to influenza, we know that coronavirus is probably mutating at a different rate than influenza. So presents very significant challenges for vaccine developers. And there is a recognition at this point in time that perhaps one vaccine is not going to be enough, and that there probably will have to be more than one vaccine to be able to address the challenges that lay before us.
Just a quick follow-up on that. It has been said that we could be looking at a year to a year and a half before a vaccine is developed and proven successful in clinical trials. I know that those are happening literally all over the world as we speak. Do you get the sense that that's true, that we are going to have to be patient and we're going to have to be vigilant in dealing with the disease on our own while we're in the wait for a vaccine?
I don't think we can actually depend on the vaccine to address coronavirus. I think that depends on which day you speak to which expert as to what the timelines are going to be. But I think most people would agree that it'll be early part of next year before we see significant production of a vaccine, and the final trials are not in, so we don't really know how effective this vaccine is going to be, how long immunity is going to be conferred by the vaccine. Actually, there's still a lot of controversy over the effectiveness of the antibodies that are being developed to this particular virus. Not only, it's one thing to measure antibodies, it's another thing to measure the effectiveness of the antibody and how long the antibody will survive before it becomes weakened and unable to deal with the virus. So a lot of things up in the air. Some very brilliant minds are working on this, and there's a lot of financial and social incentive to get this done. A vaccine usually takes many, many years to come to market. And we all know that politicians and senior scientists have promised that they have basically left no rock unturned to get this done quicker. However, from now till then, there are many, many more infections that are going to occur. And not a very significant challenge will be the whole distribution of vaccines, the manpower required or the personal power required to deliver these vaccines, the logistics of manning a vaccination program. Who do you give it to first, for instance? That will be very, very, very significant. So we need to do our part first before we basically say the vaccine is going to save us.
Can you give us a sense, just kind of following up on that, on the idea that COVID-19 may always be with us in some form or another, likely in the form that we're finding in now, and that it may be with us partly because it has spread so quickly and so dramatically around the world. So do you have a sense that we're always going to have to deal with this one way or another, even if a vaccine is tested, is successful, and as you say, is made available one stage at a time?
Well, conventional thinking has been that infections of this nature wax and wane. There was always a kind of a seasonality to viral infections, such that in the summertime things would kind of fall away, and in other pandemics that was the case, especially in the Spanish flu is a good example of that. And then the second wave would often be worse than the first wave. But coronavirus appears to be very different in that if you take the United States, for example, the so-called Sun Belt in the U.S. is now being hit the hardest. So the idea that there was going to be a fall-off in viral load because of the summer has really not come to fruition. So to answer your question, I'm going to have to waffle, because I don't think anybody can say that this virus is going to behave like any other virus, because it is a different virus, and that's why it's called novel. So I'm hoping that the experts are correct in that if we practice social distancing and use good hand washing and masks, then we at least can reduce the load and allow our health system to be able to cope with the cases, as we have done in Canada.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about hand washing and masks in just a moment, because we do want to take some time in this interview to stress the importance of continuing with these practices. Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on the point you made just a couple of moments ago regarding the potential for a second wave. And we've had many infectious disease experts, people with the World Health Organization as well, folks across the world saying it's not a matter of if, but when. And that there could be several small waves and small outbursts as well that would follow this second wave, targeted for, some people say later in the summer, some say the fall, others say close to Christmas. What is your take on the concept of a second wave and on recurrences of coronavirus?
Well, I know that the U.S. is kind of stands alone on this. It's kind of the outlier, but they're not even through the first wave.
No.
And then the other piece of this, if you look at developing countries such as the continent of Africa and South America and Asia, they're lagging behind somewhat with their first wave. And add to that transportation has become the single most important aspect in spreading the disease. And I think people have tried to look at the dynamics of the Spanish flu and trying to compare it to this current pandemic. But the difference is that transportation was entirely different in the 20th century, especially the early part of the 20th century. So we end up in a situation where we have been able to move this virus around the world very, very quickly. So areas that have it under control, as it were, inverted commas, are always subject to the risk of importing the virus again and having flare-ups here and there, which would, be the beginning of another wave. Whether it's a microwave or a big wave, who knows? So I have to waffle on that one, because I don't think we can look at the dynamics of this particular infection like we have looked at others, and that we are always subject to this constant risk of while the virus is around somewhere, then it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned transportation, and I mean, we're in a situation here in Nova Scotia where we now have 5 cases of COVID-19, 5 active cases, after having things been quiet for a few weeks in a row that there weren't any active cases at all. The 5th and latest case comes from a truck driver coming in from the U.S., that person, of course, entering the 14-day isolation. So we're in a spot now where, even with all the precautions and all the difficult measures that we in Nova Scotia have taken over the past 4 months, it's only a matter of 1 or 2 people that can come in and start spreading this all over again.
Well, I think we learned that recently with the experience out of PEI and the young student from the U.S. That was a very unfortunate situation, and I guess it proves the point that you need to have some method of stratifying your risk and being able to address the issues around contact tracing adequately. So yes, as we open up our borders and permit more individuals in, we will have to accept the risk that's associated with that.
Definitely.
And as to whether we can quantify that risk becomes a real challenge, because the problem with testing, if we were to test individuals coming in, is that it's only a snapshot of in time. It's only valuable until the individual leaves the room that he's been tested, or he or she has been tested in, and comes in contact with an individual. So, and we now know that the asymptomatic group is actually at higher risk of spreading the disease.
Okay. Well, let's isolate things now to Canada and to Nova Scotia and to Atlantic Canada in general. We've now had 4 months of the various social distancing restrictions that have been going on nationally, but also region by region. What's your feeling on how Canada and Nova Scotia in particular have been doing in battling this disease? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if you look at Nova Scotia, we have done exceptionally well, and if you take out the long-term care cases, we are looking at pretty impressive numbers based on population. I think based on what I have observed, certainly up until very recently, I've been very impressed at how seriously people have taken the recommendations from public health. People did stay home, which I think was the most significant thing that they could do. They did practice social distancing accordingly. I mean, this is a traditional rural community where family is really, really important, and relationships are at the core of society here, and yet people did not visit their own children, did not visit loved ones. We shut down nursing homes. So we did what was expected of us, which is a double-edged sword, because for all the pain that people experienced since March, they now feel even more upset when we're told that we have increased risk because we might be importing cases. So I think that there's the management of expectations going down the road will be very difficult. With respect to the rest of Canada, I mean, we have some real stars, obviously, in British Columbia, which have had tremendous leadership in that respect.
Dr. Bonnie Henry, their chief medical officer, has become almost a celebrity on her own, really.
Yes, her manner, her obvious expertise, her worldwide recognition for the work that she's done on other types of infectious diseases, I think that was brought to bear, and I think the proof is in the pudding there. And we have had unusual situations like Central Canada, where we've had very, very low case numbers, which is also remarkable. And then we've had some tremendous challenges in Ontario and Quebec, which I think speak to the issues around travel and importation of infections, and then the whole management around long-term care in those two provinces have become a real embarrassment in many, many respects.
Yeah. And of course, we're seeing the federal government is still keeping the Canada-US border closed through to July 28th. And it's often been said that the former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau referred to the relationship between Canada and the US as a mouse sleeping next to an elephant. And today it feels like a mouse sleeping next to a very sick elephant. And I just wonder, looking at border controls and looking at what's gone on in the US, do you feel that's a wise decision? Do we run the risk of exposure and significant exposure to COVID-19 if we were to reopen the border at this point?
So it is a porous border. Some of these are essential people, like truck drivers and some healthcare workers that cross the border on a regular basis. And so obviously, you need that level of the ability to have people cross the borders is really important. But then we have issues where we have had business people go back and forth under special exemptions, and that's been rescinded recently. And then we have individuals who have property in Canada who have claimed that they need to get to their property or to visit family. So that's where the risk becomes very difficult to manage, especially if these individuals come from hotspots. And I think what has been particularly worrisome is a Yale's University study released last week where the so-called super spreader individuals have been identified, and these individuals are often young, that are completely asymptomatic, and have now been identified in this study that they reference as causing 50% of the COVID cases identified. So it becomes an extremely challenging situation for border control individuals, public health people and politicians, to identify who the people are that are going to cause us the greatest risk. Do we close the border completely? Well, that becomes extremely difficult given that the U.S. is our largest trading partner. And no matter what we believe is the right thing to do, we have to be practical about how we're going to survive as an economy in this country. And we all know that this has been a very expensive process, as was released yesterday. Over $300 billion has been spent. And unfortunately, that was looking backwards. That is not looking forwards. So we actually don't know what that number is going to be. So I think at some level, we are going to have to get our head around living with COVID, accepting a level of risk, and trying to understand how best to mitigate that risk. But it's going to be here, and unfortunately, people are going to get sick because of it.
Well, let me pick up on that theme, and let's talk for just a couple of moments about the idea of reopening. And we are seeing Canada, and in particular Nova Scotia and the Atlantic provinces, reopen to a little bit. And I can say as well, too, I'll ask for a wide shot from our good folks in the control room, Becky Borno and Nick Woodrow, that they can see that you and I are properly socially distanced. We are 6 feet apart here. And actually, we are back in the Telile studio. This is the first time in 4 months that I have been here, and Dr. Martel was one of our last official guests to come in and use the studio for any kind of television purposes. So it's kind of interesting to look at it that way, that we are now looking at ways that we can continue business. And we've seen certain businesses allowed to reopen, everything from restaurants and bars to hair salons, a lot of public places. The gathering limits for Nova Scotia within the social distancing boundaries had gone up to 50 in June. Then just 12 days later, they jumped to 200 indoors and 250 outdoors. And this, of course, social distancing, wearing masks and such. So I want to get your thoughts on this, if we could, just starting here in Nova Scotia, the concept of reopening and getting businesses going again and allowing the public to gather again, and the idea of living with COVID, as you say. What do you think about all of this? How are we doing in Nova Scotia?
Well, I want to preface my comments by saying that it will be interesting to know if what the Yale people have reported with respect to super spreaders and aerosolized viral particles become a significant parameter around how you're going to decide how many people can be gathered in a certain area. Because their data shows that even in a studio like this, 6 feet apart means that if there are aerosolized particles, this studio is now contaminated. So by no means do we have a definitive answer on that point. But in the meantime, there are certain things that we can do. And I think the recommendations now are clear. In some provinces, this has become mandatory, that masks be worn in all indoor situations like malls, churches, public buildings. And I do not believe that that is a bad idea. I would favor a voluntary mask-wearing indoor policy in the early stages of this to see how things are going. And certainly if the case count rises, then it's politicians who will have to make that decision based on the recommendations of public health as to whether it becomes mandatory. But the use of masks, it's absolutely unequivocal that they are effective. I think there's been some controversy around why now, when nations like Singapore and Asian countries proved very clearly, very early on, that wearing masks or PPE did reduce their case count. And I think Dr. Anthony Fauci addressed that issue very clearly last week in a news conference when he said, bottom line, it was a resource issue. We just did not have the PPE in quantities sufficient to supply health workers and high-risk individuals, so that we did not make it as a general recommendation that people wear masks. But that has changed. The supply chain is much more dependent, and people can buy masks almost anywhere today. And homemade cloth masks, following the recommendations around triple layering, etc., and the proper materials being used, like cotton, are effective. You do not need an N95 masks. And if you're outdoors and nobody is around you, then you don't have to wear a mask. And I think those are very practical ways of doing that. Very, very important that the masks be used properly, that it not be touched with your hands, that when you remove it, you put it in a Ziploc bag. There's no point in putting a mask that you've worn into your pocket or into a handbag, because then that surface is contaminated. It can be reused that day if you pick it up correctly by the ear elastics and put it back on, but the idea is not to touch the mask and not to touch your face.
Sure. So just to pick up on that, I'm glad that you brought up that. I've brought in a couple of different samples of masks here. Now this is a cloth mask that I've been using on and off for a little bit now, and sometimes it works better in some situations than others, but there's a cloth one. And we have here, now this is mainly paper type of products, and you have to be careful because, as you can see, the strap just broke right off that, so you have to be careful about how you use them. But the bottom line with a mask, and I wanted to get your direct thoughts on this, my understanding is that the reason we wear a mask at all in situations like this is so if we have a risk of having the virus, it's not transmitted to other people. The mask protects us from transmitting the virus. And I mean, it also, of course, protects others from getting it, but it's mainly so that we're offering a service to others. Do you subscribe to that feeling? Is that your basic feeling about masks?
Absolutely. An individual wearing a mask demonstrates regard for others. That's the message in wearing a mask. The viral particles live in the respiratory tract. And this is one of the unusual things about coronavirus, is that it has a high reproductive rate in the respiratory tract. So when you cough or sneeze or even speaking, viral droplets come out of your mouth and drop onto surfaces or within the so-called 6 feet. Now, there are all sorts of other data that shows that it probably could be long further than that. And then if we go back to the aerosolized possibility, then that changes the water on the beans. But bottom line is that a mask will trap a significant number of viral particles and prevent them from infecting others. So You can do your community a favor by doing that, especially in grocery stores, liquor stores, and in public places.
Yeah. What are you seeing locally, just out of curiosity, in terms of mask wearing and people following safe social distancing practices? I mean, we want to be careful, obviously, because this is mainly broadcast to a Richmond County audience. We're not looking to point fingers or offend anybody, but just from your view in this area, how do you feel people are doing in terms of following the rules and taking care of each other?
Well, I think initially, as I mentioned earlier, in the first 8 weeks of this situation, people were very careful about social distancing and hand washing and staying at home. I see a number of masks around, but not enough, especially in grocery stores. We initially set out that we would have one family member do all the shopping, basically be the gopher for the family. That has changed, that more people are out and about. And I think the issue around social distancing is diminishing, and because people believe, oh, we're over the hump, we have had no cases, and therefore there's no virus here on the island or in Richmond County. That's incorrect. And if the Yale study is correct, there are a bunch of asymptomatic individuals walking around that could be a problem. So my recommendation would be, following the public health guidelines, that if you are entering a public space that is enclosed, that you should wear a mask in regard for others. With respect to hand washing, obviously sanitizers, 70% alcohol is the best product. I'm not a fan of gloves. I think the data is pretty clear on that you would achieve a better result in using proper hand washing techniques with hot soap and water to get the virus off your hands. So if you are coming from a shopping experience, for instance, the first thing that you should do is wash your hands when you come in the house. And then you can go about and do what you need to do.
Sure. And I mean, we talked earlier about whether COVID-19 has changed all that much, and it seems like so long ago that we were getting that very basic warning: wash your hands thoroughly, and people were saying it all over, wash your hands. There was an internet meme going around basically saying, well, sing happy birthday, and then all of a sudden people were piping up and saying, well, you could sing this, you could sing Barrett's Privateers, or the Island Song, or things like this, or American Pie, and wash your hands. And now it seems so long ago, and it almost seems like we right now are at a point of pandemic fatigue. And I wonder how much that worries you in terms of trying to take care of this disease. That, like you say, a lot of people are looking at the fact that we've been at this for 4 months and just shrugging and saying, well, we flattened the curve in Nova Scotia, the caseload is low, we don't have to worry. Is pandemic fatigue a concern for you at this point?
Well, the greatest enemy is complacency. And, I think it's going to require a little bit more emphasis from public health and individuals that are in positions of some influence to try to make that point, that we have to be vigilant. It is, as you say, it is not if, it is when we are going to have a second wave. And pretty confident that the fall, I don't know when in the fall, but that we will have more cases in Nova Scotia. I can't see why it would be any different here than anywhere else in the world.
Last question to you. I mean, you have been involved in many aspects of medicine, everything from being a GP to palliative care over your time in the field. And you just recently, over the last few months, went back to actively practicing medicine so that you would be ready if you were needed in terms of COVID-19. Okay. How do you compare the time we're living in now with anything else that you've seen in terms of the idea that really this goes right back to the individual in terms of having to look after the needs and the health of other individuals. Does this compare at all with anything you've experienced over the time you've been in medicine?
No, not at all. This is a whole different ball game. Not only are health workers at very significant risk for their health. I mean, if you look at the data around the number of health workers around the world who have been impacted personally, that is completely unprecedented. And not only have many died, but some have suffered the long-term sequelae of COVID-19, and that, I must say, has been not very well emphasized. I think what people do not appreciate, and I think it's because the media has basically stressed the fact that people, they kind of focus on death rates, etc. But there are a number of people who get this virus and suffer all sorts of side effects for many, many months after they have had the virus. And some have had very, very dramatic consequences, like amputated limbs and long-term lung problems and issues around, losing their sense of smell and taste for a very long time. And no, they haven't died, and they have survived. But if you have a significant number of the population that are significantly affected that way, in which they cannot return to an active life, then that's a significant cost to the person and to society. And then the whole way of doing business, I must say it's quite remarkable to have social interaction today and feeling that the individual that you're associating with is a risk to you. I'm closer to 70 than 60, and I have never experienced a situation where there was a fear of associating with friends or acquaintances. And in rural Nova Scotia, where it is absolutely so critical to have those associations to survive, it becomes a real challenge for society. So, practicing medicine is very, very difficult in those circumstances. And virtual medicine has come in as a support, but it's not the same. It's very difficult to examine someone in a virtual manner. So I think that the generation that's going to follow me in medicine is going to have to deal with this on an ongoing basis, because this is not the last coronavirus that's going to jump into the human body and cause us some problems.
I've asked every person that I've interviewed talking about restructuring as a result of COVID-19 and changing the way that businesses are run, schools are run, and basically the way we live. Is there anything positive that we can take away from all this? Is there something that happened in the last 4 months and something continuing to happen as we go forward that we can look at and say, well, at least we can take this knowledge and this experience and live our lives differently and more positively than we did before COVID-19 hit? Do you see any sign of that anywhere?
Well, there are a number of things. On a macro level, I think the issues around supply chain, the globalization of the supply chain, is certainly, you're going to have to take a second look at that. The fact is that both the US and Canada got caught short in relying on foreign suppliers for very basic, personal protective equipment. That will change. I think that will be brought back to our shores and managed locally. And I think that's a good thing. The other thing that I think is good is we're going to have a pretty serious look at how we organize gatherings, in that there's certainly an awareness going forward that we have to pay a lot more attention to hand washing and the things that we should be doing anyway about, communicable diseases. That will be made very clear. And I think the general training of individuals around risk management is going to change significantly. Those are some of the obvious things that we're going to be looking at.
All right.
And the other piece of this is public health has been the forgotten aspect of healthcare over the years. And we have learned through this whole experience that if you don't have a very strong public health backbone, it's very difficult to address challenges of this nature. So I'm hopeful that funding for public health will be looked at in a much more serious way, and that we will ramp up our public health personnel such that you adopt a philosophy like firefighting. You don't pay firefighters based on the number of fires they fight. You pay them to stand by for when there is a fire to address. And that's the same with public health. You have to have some redundancy built into this, some ability to have capacity when needed, because going down the road, we're going to need this again.
We've covered a lot of ground on this one topic this morning, and I appreciate you giving us some time here. Did you want to add anything else about all this before we wrap up?
No, just that I hope that people kind of take a very strong look at the challenges that face us going forward in the fall, and that I know that it's inconvenient to wear a mask and to social distance and to be vigilant, but that's the only thing that we can do to help ourselves. I don't think we can really rely on a vaccine to save us from this. We have to save ourselves.
Very well put. Dr. Robert Martel, thank you for coming in this morning and for giving us some time and some thoughts here. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right. Dr. Robert Martel is a general physician based in West Arishat. We're happy to have him here in the Telile studio today. And that wraps up this week's edition of Telile 24/7. I'd like to thank all of you for joining in, and I'd like to thank the folks here at the Telile studios who've been helping me out so much on my first day back in the building, Nick Boudreau and Becky Borono. And a special thank you to Dr. Robert Martel for coming in and sharing his unique and varied perspectives on the treatment and reaction to COVID-19 here in Nova Scotia and around the world. If you have any suggestions for future interviews or story ideas for the show, or you'd just like to leave some comments on what you thought of this episode or other episodes, there are many ways that you can reach us. You can give us a call here at the Telile Studios. That number is 902-226-1928. And you can contact me directly. You can give me a call at 902-625-8863, or you can email me. That address is adamjrcook@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow Telile Community Television on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you go to Telile's YouTube channel, you'll find every single episode of Telile 24/7, including this one. And you can also see some individual interviews and stories from the show. And my friends here at Telile have been producing a lot of wonderful, colorful new programming over the last couple of months, so you can check that out as well. For now, I'm Adam Cooke. Thank you for joining in. It's great to be back in the studio and great to be joining you once again. And I look forward to seeing you very soon for our next episode of Telile 24/7.